Speaking of shilling, what's that shirt you're wearing, Mike?
Oh gosh, you had to do it, right?
Oh, hey,
I
wow.
had to, yeah.
I mean,
Since
how much
we're-
they pay
since we're
you?
video
How much do
now.
they pay
Yeah.
you to wear that shirt?
One free shirt. That's actually no. I think I paid for this one. I think I paid for this shirt. Actually,
Hey,
yeah.
you're getting free swag. If I don't get a free shirt by the time we record next, you're gonna have to find a new co-host.
You're walking.
because I'm walking. I'm playing
please don't
hardball
tempt
here.
me. Don't tempt me, Jacob. That is going to backfire on you. I promise.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Welcome back to this episode of the Voyage podcast, which I guess I'm not supposed to call it part 2 because we can't do a part 2 anymore, but it is going to follow up a little bit from our previous discussion on just sort of the prophetic nature of mythology. And because there was so much kind of that we wanted to do foundational background stuff, we didn't get to go into a lot of the biblical examples and really how they can be, you'd say, I don't know, fulfilled or maybe paralleled to some of the more either modern examples of prophets that we would see. One of them being probably the most prominent one that to both of our imagination is Gandalf from the Lord of the Rings series. And so I wanted to kind of go through some of our Old Testament biblical prophets, actually some of the New Testament prophetic figures that we find, and how did Gandalf kind of like live these out a little bit in his character in whether you want to go The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, any of that stuff. How's that sound, Jacob?
Well, let's just go over the facts here. So your intention was to have a podcast about Gandalf. You were going to use prophets to do it, and namely biblical prophets. And then we spent an hour talking, and we didn't talk about Gandalf or biblical prophets. So now we're doing a second podcast. Now we're doing a second podcast that's supposed to be what your first podcast was meant to be. It's not really a sequel. It's not really a part 2. It's more like a remake, right? Or would you call it like a requel? You know how they?
I thought you were going to call it a reboot.
Like they have like the soft reboots where it's like a sequel. Like they did a Texas Chainsaw Massacre sequel that was like just ignores all the continuity. The Halloween franchise has done this like 5 times. I don't know if that's.
I thought you were going to refer to it as this is the Rings of Power equivalent to our first episode, which was the Lord of the Rings series. So anyway, you want to think
like that, Mike.
You know what? Whatever helps, Jacob. Whatever helps is fine with me. So
hey, no, we're just
anyway
redo. This is the Hot Shots part Deux of our podcast.
I teased Jacob in our cold open, I guess you want to call it, referring to him as a mouthpiece because that is the, I guess, almost definition that you would give to a prophetic figure. And not just in the Old Testament by any means, because obviously there were prophetic figures that would have been recognized outside of the biblical tradition. But that's just kind of the one that we're most familiar with and what we're going to talk about the most.
I thought you were referring to my divine inerrancy, but I mean, I'll give you all that too.
So, well, where that mouthpiece idea comes from, right, is that he's speaking for, right, inspired by the person that he's speaking for. And obviously from our Christian standpoints, the Old Testament figures would be that mouthpiece for God, that's representative for God. They also played, because we talked a lot about Canticle for Leibowitz and how the prophet has a wandering sort of role, having to, they in a sense, they're in the world, but they're not of the world, right? To kind of quote that very common Christian description. I think it comes from 2 Peter or 1 Peter or something, but that idea of being in the world and not of the world is a very kind of prophetic characteristic. Mm-hmm. So they're wanderers. And then, of course, they're all oftentimes associated with miracles. Not that that's necessarily the case, but it's almost one of those things where it's like, it goes hand in hand where you have this holy person of God. Miracles are going to inevitably follow. Is that, I guess, fair,
Yeah. This is an opportunity for me to double down on my old hobby horse of I think that we have this dichotomy between the natural and the supernatural that is really modern and really recent and kind of inaccurate to how reality is. What you're pointing out is that people who are so close to God that they are his very like mouthpiece are also going to be
Mhm.
people that are so close to God that they act in the name of and with the power and grace of God by
Yeah.
by virtue, to use that word precisely, of their proximity to God, their relationship with God and things like that.
They're
And so
ministers of
it's
the sacred fire, you know, you can
they're
almost say.
able to they operate, and so saints as such take on this type of a role for us in the new covenant, right?
Mhm.
Um and so the idea that you see miracles being worked out by saints and things like that, it's not it's just an example of what it looks like when people have drawn so close to God that God starts to kind of pour out of them, right?
Yeah.
And so, these types of things that you're describing that the prophets have, they're kind of like these outliers in the Old Testament. And the New Testament has ushered in a new age in which, like, we're all kind of prophets. We're all called to be prophets anyway.
Yeah.
We don't all have the same kind of like prophecy. Though our last conversation, we talked about how prophecy can be just like knowing history and just like seeing
Well,
the signs of the times.
and yeah, actually, to that point, just as a really quick aside, so yeah, every at least the ancient historic liturgical Christians like Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism, they recognize that you receive this prophetic charism or character at your baptism. So you're called to be priest, prophet, and king just by your baptism. But there's also a unique outpouring of the spiritual gifts of prophecy, which, yeah, can, like you said, can be manifested uniquely depending on the person, just like any of the
Mm,
spiritual gifts can be, right? So there's the spiritual
yeah.
gift of teaching, but not everybody is going to necessarily have that formal or specific role either. So yeah, prophecy or prophetic gift would be just part of that. And like you
It
said, it's
seems
not
to
about
me.
necessarily knowing the future, right? But sometimes knowing history, as you said.
Hmm. Well, and just having a closeness to what's true, good, and beautiful, right? And
Hmm.
seeing it when it's kind of like to go back to like some Matrix stuff, when Neo finally sees all like the digits flying down the walls and things like that at the end of the first Matrix movie. It's because
Yeah.
he's like transcended his limitations and now is like kind of like one with the Matrix, so to speak, kind of thing. And now he can just like see things as they truly are. I think that's
Um,
kind of an analogy for what I'm
Well,
describing
in
here.
in that world, right, the real are the numbers, the combination of numbers. It's not the images, right? Because it's very much a Plato's cave thing where he's the
Hmm.
one who only sees, he's the one who not only sees the shadows, but sees the things behind the shadows. And in that world, it's, what looks to us like real, but it's just a combination of numbers and letters and or a code. And so it's the prophet, even though it doesn't have to be the exact analogy of, you see the code in the matrix, it's you're seeing reality for what it is. And that
Well, good.
goes hand in hand with seeing, God for what God is or who God is.
And how reality is operating at any given time. A good
Mhm.
example of this in the Old Testament, we're talking about prophets, is I think it was Elisha, right, who was standing before the armies of who were they? The Assyrians were coming to, and he has the vision of like the angelic hosts all flying around
Uh-huh.
him. Um, those hosts were always there. It's just that like you couldn't see it, like no one else
I
could see it, but
think
then
it
he
might be
opened people's
Isaiah,
eyes.
but not that it's, I think that might be Isaiah, but not that we have to quibble about that.
Eh, um,
But
But
seeing seeing
I think you're
the
wrong.
angelic
I think you're
realities.
wrong, Shram. But
Okay.
not that we have to quibble about it. But
Okay.
no, I don't know. I get kind of bad when you get into the later Old Testament stuff. You always start reading the Old Testament, and then you like peter off by the time you get to the second half of it. At least that's
No, you
that's what
got it.
I've
You're right.
done. That's what I've
No.
always done.
Hey,
Um,
I'll I fact checked you. You're right. So go ahead.
oh, okay, very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for throwing that in there. You didn't have to.
Mm.
But I was just listening to, along these lines, I was listening to one of my favorites speakers. His name was Father Thomas Hopko. He passed in the, it's probably about 10 years ago now. I this man has had such an impact on me in his discourse that I actually named my fourth kid kind of after him, specifically Father Thomas. But
Mm.
anyway, we're in the context of recording this around the time of Ascension, and I was just listening to him speak about the Ascension and things like that, and he's talking about how, and this is just saying what Father Hopko has to say. If people have a disagreement about this, then just don't shoot the messenger, said Prophet Jacob. But
Hmm.
it's like that people, a lot of the things that Christ did, like at the Ascension, people had to have like eyes to see it, kind of thing. And so the idea that Christ, as it's recorded in the scriptures, like ascended into the skies, kind of thing, right, and behind clouds or whatever. He's suggesting that that's a vision that's given to people who had eyes to see and ears to hear, kind of thing.
Mhm.
The reason why I have that caveat, if you have a problem with this, take it up with like Father Hopko, is because I could see that being controversial. We do have a tendency to read scriptures with a like kind of simple literalism, which I'm fine with. I'm fine with that method of doing things, but I think that there's more nuance than that typically, if I'm giving my honest opinion. And a lot of that I get from Father Hopko, actually.
Because you run into that danger of almost it being like a self-fulfilling, like a closed in sort of system where it's like, oh well, you just don't get it because God just hasn't given you enough faith yet. You're not special enough or whatever, or you're not this enough to have received the vision of Jesus actually ascending into heaven, to use your example, or whatever example you wanted to use. And that obviously could be problematic, because then it sort of becomes this like, well, how, is it really even, it strikes you as unfair, where it's like, well, then then I just haven't been given a chance to quote unquote have
Right.
faith, or to have eyes to see or ears to hear, to use that language. And that's kind of, to go back to, again, some of our foundational things about the prophet. One of the reasons why they were supposed to strike people as so weird is because it was supposed to like shake you out of it's kind of like, if you can't tell with this crazy example of how this prophet is living his life, then maybe your heart is too cold, or your eyes are too closed, or whatever, to kind of keep the image. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, it also kind of it shakes it's for everyone, right? So like
Mhm.
talk about John the Forerunner, going out into the wilderness, the greatest of the prophets. He's the greatest of the
Yep.
prophets, and it's funny because you might think somebody like Elijah or Elisha, who supposedly had twice as much grace, right? Or some of these, Isaiah, right? These like big name prophets. And it always struck me as odd how much gravitas was given to John the Forerunner when I was first
Yeah.
coming into classical Christianity, because as a Protestant, he's a cool character. He shows up at the beginning and then he kind of goes away, and like he has a little cameo appearance, later on out of jail, but like he's just not that big of a he certainly doesn't have like the epic odyssey that someone like Elijah has or something like
Mhm.
that. He's got this kind of minimal reality going on in the New Testament. He's just like a setup for Jesus, quote unquote.
Yeah.
But that's just not his relationship to historic Christianity. Historic Christianity reveres him as the greatest of all prophets. Christ himself calls him the greatest of all prophets. And it's like,
Well,
really?
and if
All he
you
did was
to
baptize people and dress up in, fur and eat honey. What's so like, how does
yeah,
that compare to Elijah, Um,
to your point, I want to speak to that. As I'm sure you're wont to do, if you go to if you go to St. Peter's Square at the Vatican, they have the statue of St. Peter's, and you have Jesus in the middle, and the first one is John the Forerunner, before
mhm.
any of the other apostles. And so
If
there's
you
definitely
go
that pride of place that you'll oftentimes see too.
If you go into any Orthodox church, we have what's called that iconostas, the iconostasis. It's the wall of icons
Hmm.
between the sanctuary and the altar. And it is extremely consistent. It's also extremely consistent in a lot of our iconography as such, that you will have in our case, the center of that wall of icons is a door that leads to the altar, right? But of course, that's where the Eucharist is. And then right to, let's see here, I always get this is weird because it's mirrored. But as we're just going to go as you look at it, to the left of those doors would be Christ, right? Or he's on the right. If you're looking out at the sanctuary from the altar. And then right next to Christ is John the Baptist, John the Forerunner. And then on the left-hand side of those doors is the Theotokos, Mary, the Mother of God. And in our iconography, like if you look at an icon of the Last Judgment, you look at an icon of really all kinds of stuff. I think the Paschal icon, the resurrection, I think John the Forerunner is right next to Jesus. He's right next to Jesus all the time in Orthodox iconography, but he's definitely right next to Jesus in every single Orthodox church that exists, as far as I'm aware. Like it's always Christ and John the Baptist by his side.
There's one more example. You're mentioning how, you'll have John the Forerunner and then Mary the Theotokos. So there's actually a similar one, the Eisenheim altarpiece or the Grunwald altarpiece, where you'll have Jesus on the cross, and it's an altarpiece. It's supposed to be behind an altar, and you'd have Mary and John the Apostle on one side and John the Baptist on the other side, which if you can tell that it's obviously not supposed to be a biblical literalism because John the Baptist had been long dead by this point. But it is interesting that kind of like what you were describing. And I think going into the whole like kind of iconic description or the circumstances in which you would see it, it's supposed to be kind of a like heavenly sort of depiction or Jesus in his glory. And John the Forerunner is always there, obviously alongside Mary. And what's interesting here is that it's actually Jesus on the cross too. But like this isn't a art history or art theory podcast by any means, but just to kind of add another example to what you were sharing.
Well, all of the iconography, and so again, that's not a coincidence that in St. Peter's Basilica, what you're seeing there is just statuary in the classical traditional depiction. Like, in other words, that was very likely not someone's just like, hey, I know, I'll put John the Forerunner next to him.
Yeah,
he's
why
drawing
not?
From this would be fun.
Yeah.
He's drawing from a very ancient liturgical tradition of depicting John as always seated at the left of Jesus, basically, because Mary is at the right of Jesus. If you're looking from the altar out to the sanctuary.
Well, and I think just a little bit more background on the St. Peter's one too. So it's the St. Peter's Square was supposed to be designed as like, if you know how it kind of like makes two like semicircles going around, and then St. Peter's in kind of the back of it, and it's sort of like bringing you. So that was supposed to be, I think it was Bernini who made those. It was supposed to be like arms that was welcoming people in. But the idea too is that it's Jesus and the apostles with John the Forerunner, because it's the idea about going out to bring others in. And so that's another part of that prophetic call where John the Forerunner had it first, right? And then Jesus sent, you were talking about ascension, right? Sending out the apostles to do that same thing. So sending them out to the ends of the earth, but ultimately to bring them into the fold. And so that's why, at least in this example, it's John the Forerunner with the apostles, that they're being sent out, but it's in these arms that look like they're hugging you or bringing you in, because that's sort of the purpose or the idea.
Yeah, I've not studied kind of the architectural reasoning behind it, but I always kind of assumed that at least it invoked for me a kind of like Acropolis-like auditorium, like you have a kind of, you're walking into a stadium of sorts, right?
And
but
the Pope does speak from to the crowds there too, so.
But none of that negates, like that's to your point is what I'm trying to say, is that it feels like you're entering into a place where you're being invited to.
Oh, with Jacob, when we disagree, people will know. It's all right. It'll be obvious. No, I know.
Just remember who's the prophet in this relationship, folks. That's all I want to say.
Wait. Oh, you mean like the corporate thing? Gotcha. Yeah. So we talked about.
Of course, clearly not the favorite since I don't have the sway. So.
Yeah. So talked about them being exiles / wanderers, right? Elijah was also not just a wanderer, but he was he wasn't a self-imposed wandering. He was an exile, right? He was chased out.
Yeah, he was cast out.
And prophets certainly have that component to them as well. which, we haven't, again, we're taking all this time, we haven't even gotten to Gandalf yet, but do you see any of those?
At least we're
do you
talking about
see
Old
any of
Testament
those-
prophets now, right?
Yeah.
Or at least
yeah.
St. John is kind of an intermediary, maybe.
Well, no, he's on the list too. I just thought we'd get to him eventually, but you just kind of jumped
As is my want. That's
you
right.
double jumped a couple of of other prophets we've overlooked, but
I'm here to shake up the status quo, Mike. That's just my purpose. Is just
very
to
prophetic
shake you out of complacency with your outlines. It's not this legalistic outline thing, Mike. It's about a way of participating. Okay.
That was
Where's the lie?
gosh.
Where's the lie?
Yeah.
Huh? Come on.
little hamming it up over here.
Dropping pearls.
Yeah. So so we have the exile / wander, and Gandalf is very much that wander, but he was also like sent out. If you want to think of kind of how we're sort of told the history, the wizards all came to Middle Earth, is there was very much a sending out. And whether you want to take the Rings of Power show as your example, or if you want to consider that canon, it was sent out in sort of like a comet, right? But then they become this wandering. Yeah, that's how it is.
That's fine. I didn't have any issues with him coming that way. It's an interesting take. I honestly never really thought prior to it being depicted in a format of any kind, like what it looked like. The Astari, the wizards in Middle Earth.
Yeah.
The only thing we're ever described, like what it's like it's an appendix in the Lord of the Rings when it talks about this. Maybe. I'm sure Tolkien talked about it all kinds of places, right? But
yeah.
I know that probably the most prominent place, I think it's an appendix at the end of the Lord of the Rings books, where it talks about the coming of the Astari, the wizards. But it doesn't really specify mechanics, does it? It just says they were just sent from the Valar to...
No, there's been a lot of freedom and so that allows people to take some liberties and stuff, which you can like it or not like it. That's not, not the point of this conversation anyway.
My personal favorite interpretation of how they got there was kind of like Megazords, where you have Radagast in like a giant like mech eagle, and then you have, Gandalf in like a mech lion, and they all just kind of like come together over some rocking kind of 80s synth and show up on the shores of Middle Earth as a team. That's always just how I envisioned it.
Maybe if you write that in like a Amazon review for a product, Jeff Bezos will read it and it'll get to the right person. It'll get to the right person eventually. And that will be, that's what we'll see in season 2. I mean, you've got plenty of time. I think they maybe just started making, they'll get some rewrites in there. So, and then of course, like we've already said, that the prophets were always associated with miracles. Elijah and Elisha, definitely a lot of miracle stories with them, which we see sort of fulfilled in, John the Forerunner is described by Jesus as almost like the return of Elijah, which the Jewish people had been waiting for. I can't think of miracles of Isaiah and Ezekiel off the top of my head, but they are two that have very prominent visions of God and the angels and of divine worship. And so you have this kind of mystical, miracle sort of idea swirling around them. And of course you're going to see that with the wizards, right? That's always the mystique that the wizards carry with them throughout Middle Earth. And so Gandalf, of course. Oh yeah.
Well, sorry. Like you're saying that you couldn't think of Isaiah or Ezekiel per se. They're more like visions and things like that. But Daniel is a prophet who is big on visions, but you also have some of his life story too. We really just don't have a whole lot of life story when it comes to Isaiah and Ezekiel, I don't think. But, you get someone like Daniel, mouth of the lions, sealed up the lions' mouths kind of thing. Pretty miraculous stuff. Anyway, yeah, that was kind of a tangent, but go on. Just feeding you a little, Mike,
Yeah. So of course, the wizards are all known for performing magic in Middle Earth. I mean, to various degrees and all that. So you can see that kind of prophetic connection there.
It's interesting though. It's like a soft magic, right? Like this is this kind of like infamous dichotomy between, and am I using their language right? Is it soft and hard magic? Or soft. There's basically a common parlance for this in like nerd communities
Okay.
where you either have a system of magic that is like, it's like Harry Potter magic, where like you are just like you're pulling rabbits out of hats where there wasn't a rabbit before.
Okay.
Or there's like soft magic where it's subtle and it's more of you know, the examples given in like Lord of the Rings of Gandalf doesn't use a whole lot of like, unlike the movies, right? The movies, they depict him as much more active in his like magic casting because
Mhm.
it's a visual medium and I don't have a problem with it. It makes it interesting. It makes him feel like a wizard and things like that. But for the most part, it's like more like him capturing a moth and like whispering to the moth and the moth going to, like, that's in the books.
Yeah.
The moth goes and or talking to animals or this type of stuff that it's really nuanced and it's not very flashy, um, and even more so, Gandalf is famous for his fireworks, right? And you get
Mhm.
the impression that his fireworks are almost taken as a kind of magic, as a kind of technique within the Middle Earth
Yeah.
universe, which is accurate. I mean, even to my vantage point, the use of the kind of like use of powders and material to create, explosions and things like that. That's there's nothing unmagical about that as far as I'm
Well,
concerned.
and we see
Um,
that with Saruman too, later on. So it's almost like you see the light and the dark side of that
mhm.
techne, right? And
And the
one of
rings
them is used
themselves.
for, uh
Well, like
yeah.
outside the fact that the ring like turns someone invisible, that's a kind of hard magic. But like the influence of the ring on people is kind of its soft magic. It's
Mhm.
almost psychological, or it's operating again.
Well,
Once again, it's operating on the spectrum between what we consider quote unquote supernatural and what we consider natural, right?
Well, I think another example to that point is very often in the Lord of the Rings books they describe the magic that Saruman is able to have with his words, right? That influence or that subtle kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
talking about how it makes you like not think straight, and he'll whip people up into crowds, or he'll make it have that manipulation that he's able to. And there's
Yep.
even a line in the movie when they confront him right after the sacking of Orthanc, or the sacking of Isengard by the Ents, and they're like, don't let his words twist your mind, or something like. Doesn't Theoden
Yep.
say that? I think like I said, I'm mixing up the
Yeah.
books and the movies,
It would
but
make sense if Theoden said it. Yeah, and I do get mixed up with the movies now. But
yeah.
hey, that's to the movie's credit.
But it's funny
Um,
how, like you said, you have this go back to your fireworks example, right? It's very much a techne, but you have Gandalf, who is kind of like not just using it for entertainment, but actually using it to like bring community, like bring people together, and part of
mhm.
that is because of the entertainment. And then you have Saruman, who's using it to destroy, right? Whether it's the, destroying of Helm's Deep or any of that. So it's becoming a weapon. And so there you can kind of see the two sides of the same coin.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. And
you also,
they're both sorcery, basically, right?
yeah.
They're both this again, it's which is fine. That's a fine word. We can call munitions sorcery as far as I'm
Mhm.
concerned. It is. That's what it is.
Well, and we've what was it? Was it in the our ring episode, our ring conversation, where it's like if you scratch magic hard enough, you'll find the science underneath. But if you keep scratching the science, it'll eventually just seem like magic again anyway, or something. So
100%. Yeah, yeah. It's
and
not like
yeah,
science is just descriptive. It's not explanatory per se. I mean, it's explanatory in the sense that you can follow the trail, like cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and
well,
effect,
it'll give
until
you.
eventually you get to, I don't know, right? Like
Well, it's kind
it's still
of
magic.
it to kind of go like it's sort of like when you distinguish when Aristotle gives the four causes, like what we call science nowadays is really really good about the material cause, but when people talk about things like magic, they're maybe looking at more like the efficient cause or whatever, in terms of like what's the power behind it, or who's the power behind it, sort of thing.
You think that
But
modern people, when they think of magic, are talking about like efficient causes? Is that what I just heard you say?
no, oh well, so what's implied by like magic now is that it's more of the personality behind it, like there's some agency, like I'm the magician and I did this thing, and that would
Mm.
be more like
Magic
the
missile.
efficient cause if you're looking at or even, yeah, when they talk about something that can find it on its own. It's like the thing had its own mind, right? It was able to find its target, so to speak. And so it's talking more about the efficient cause, whereas, the material cause is just like, okay, well, if you mix these two chemicals get together, what's going to happen, right? That's just the material.
Yeah, like I am
Or
Newton.
if you break it apart into its atoms or break it apart into its elements or something. But
I don't know if
you
I'm
also
entirely
mentioned
following what
something-
you're saying, but we're going to roll with it.
I don't know if it'd be worthwhile to backtrack
No,
and
it's fine.
re-explain it. But
I'm sure the audience got it. I'm just here to dialogue.
Okay.
Admit naivety, admit ignorance. That's what I'm doing right here.
Well, and to be fair, it wasn't in the outline either. This is just off the old noodle.
I'm just slowly turning this into a magic episode again.
I know. It's like this is like the third time that it's like, oh, I guess we're talking about magic again. So
well, you're the one that wanted to talk about Gandalf. He's a wizard, Mike.
Okay, but the
You're
whole
talk
point
about
is
a
that
wizard without magic.
the whole point, though, is that he's representing this prophetic figure, and that prophetic figures are about more than just the performing miracles or it's not about seeing the future or whatever. But you mentioned something else actually in passing of when Gandalf speaks to that moth to go tell the eagles, right, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course we see in the Hobbit movies, Radagast will have conversations with the animals or talk to them, and there's something somewhat similar, right? Because Elijah. Not that the Bible ever says he has a conversation with the ravens, but the ravens are sent to give him food, and so they're given some sense of whether you want to call it cognition or not that you necessarily call it like they have God gave them rational souls so that they could go find Elijah and recognize him and bring him bread, but there's this deeper idea of. Because the prophet is so in touch with the source of reality, that is God, then all of creation that flows from God, he's also going to be in touch with, or she's also going to be in touch with. And so that would, of course, include the animals. And so we not only have stories with Elijah, but later on in the Christian tradition, post-biblical, we have St. Benedict, we have St. Francis of Assisi, right? We have all of these prophetic figures, right? Who also have this special relationship with animals too.
And I'm not going to name names because I'm going to mess up which saints did what, but there's tons of like Eastern European and Russian saints where they're like hanging out with bear. Well, Saint Herman of Alaska, he's a name.
I knew there was a bear one. I knew there was a bear story.
I'm pretty sure it was Saint Herman. So if I messed that one up, I got to turn in my American Orthodox card. Because he's a big deal for us American Orthodox. But I'm pretty sure he was the one that placated bears and things like that. But there's examples of this also like in the Russian tradition and things like that. And it's everything you just said, where, people who are saintly, the animals help. Another example that's big in my tradition is Saint Mary of Egypt, who we celebrate in our Lenten cycle. She's one of the big names, and in that case, a lion comes out to help dig her grave. But even you think about Noah. Noah sends out birds, and for a long time, the impression you get is that the birds just come back to the ark because they have nowhere else to land, right? And that's kind of true, I'm sure. And then when the bird doesn't come back, it's like, then land must have shown up. But you also have this idea with the story itself. That like the animals come to Noah.
Yeah.
That's
before the flood. Before the
flood, and then during the flood, the animals are working with Noah. It's there's a reason why it's okay for the Noah story to be so prominent in children's nurseries all over the world, because otherwise it's just this apocalyptic tale in which everyone dies. But the nice side of it is that you have saintly Noah with his menagerie of animals, and it's a
and it is supposed to be like a new Eden.
It is. It's this garden. It's this Edenic kind of man living in harmony with the animals type situation.
So there again, I mean, if we go back to when we're baptized, we're given this office of not only priest and king but also prophet. So it's being restored to something. And every time that we have whether it's Noah and the flood or later on, it was supposed to be kind of God trying to restore everyone back to Eden. Now, when it comes to the grace that we receive at our baptism because of Christ, it's going beyond that restorative nature, but it still means that it's building upon. There was that prophetic nature that was already there. And part of that had to be with, you were talking about Noah, go back to the Adam story too. The naming of all the animals is supposed to indicate that deeper relationship with creation. And so we see that, as we've both mentioned, some of the Old Testament or biblical saints, biblical prophets, but then also some of these New Testament saints who had this prophetic character too.
Well, and I like I'm so glad you brought up the Adam naming the animals thing, because I've always kind of interpreted that as this idea that Adam is able to know the animal, right? And to give it the name that's appropriate for it. Whether that's like God entrusting Adam to have a kind of like sense of creative, like, does God sit back and like wonder what Adam is going to call him, whatever, metaphorically. Or is like, oh, let's see what Adam calls this one. Let's see what Adam, or is it more like Adam is going to recognize and just intuit like what the animal is? And in either case, I mean, they're kind of complementary as far as I'm concerned. But it's still a kind of prophetic role. It's still a kind of like innate knowledge kind of thing.
Yeah, because it goes back to, what we were talking about when it came to knowing the essences or knowing the causes of things is, in order for you to give a name to something, you have to know something essential about that thing. And so, when we talk about, Adam naming the animals, it spoke to that preternatural knowledge that humanity had before the fall. And part of that knowledge had to be with not just knowing, like seeing the externals, not just seeing like, oh, well, that, thing has 4 legs and a tail, but knowing that essence of it, knowing the essence, and that's why it got the name that it did. But all of this idea of like, in the same way that the prophet is the mouthpiece for God, and how you were saying how it's not just about being able to see the future or know the future, but it can also be about knowing the past and how, humanity works. It's actually, there's an anthropology. You're knowing the essence of humanity and saying, because I know like something deeper about human nature, I can actually predict, right, with a lot of confidence, this is how things are going to go. And so that's really the kind of prophetic knowledge that we can oftentimes see. Not that we're not denying that there's some sort of like revelation that God is giving to these prophets by any means.
For sure.
But
that's quite essential. That's sort of that there's revelation at play. But there's also just the genuine transformation of the person into an ever more godlike creature. And that, so it always begins with grace on God's part. It always begins with revelation. It always begins with God moving first and showing things and things like that. But then I also think that it slowly transforms us into people who I think that life, I honestly, always take what I say with a grain of salt here, but I think that type of sainthood that we revere in the classical traditions, is a kind of constant intuition, where people enter into a place where they're so close to Christ, and that Christ is so alive in them that they just are always acting according to instinct, always acting according to intuition. And so when you hear stories of folks coming up to a saint and the saint having some kind of, knowledge of the individual, right? Like some kind of like, telepathy or something like that. I think that it's just like a kind of like, it's just like, I guess I've kind of just like fancifully wondered what it's like to be a saint, like what these lives are like kind of thing, as I've mulled over the stories in my head. And I think it's like, they just know. Like it's just like, these are the words that come out of my mouth because those are the right words to say at this time, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, fascinating. I mean, it's really neat.
Well,
But
No, and it's a like you said, it's primarily a gift, right? Or principally a gift, but then instrumentally, we're the ones that kind of cooperate with that gift. And that can be done through, I mean, a lifetime of, in whatever saint's case, a lifetime of prayer, a lifetime of study, a lifetime of just observing and being in touch with the real world, right? And so that's how they're able to, in a sense, at that moment, whenever the moment is necessary, kind of tap into it, so to speak. Another one that stands out, another connection to Elijah. So there's, of course, that famous episode where he's competing with the prophets of Baal at the, about the sacrifice.
Oh, yeah.
And how can you not forget Gandalf talking about being a servant of the sacred fire? And so there's very much, that prophetic element of tapping into, our God is a consuming fire, according to Deuteronomy and Hebrews. And so having something, and then there's the scene of, do you remember that story in the Desert Fathers where the one monk was looking for advice from the abbot father, and his response is, why not be utterly changed into fire? And then his fingertips glow like lamps, like the menorah.
Is that Saint Macarius maybe? But I don't remember.
I don't remember there being a name to the story, honestly.
Okay, maybe not.
It might be. It's sort of like you get the feel that it's being told like a parable, I thought, but I'd have to look it up again. But there's something about tapping into, because like I said, the Jewish tradition back in Deuteronomy, the Christian tradition has continued that through the letter to the Hebrews, that God is a consuming fire. There's something about fire that not even outside of Judeo-Christianity. People have recognized something divine about fire, so to speak. And so the prophet is going to be able to tap into that, whether we're talking Elijah or we're talking Gandalf.
Absolutely. Honestly, again, this is all wrapped up into the imagery of theosis. This is all wrapped up into the imagery of becoming like God. And God is a consuming fire and a refining fire and in all that language. And so that fire is one of the most kind of, quite literally, like kind of fantastic elements, right? Like it's not like rock. It's not like a solid, it's ephemeral, right? And I think we're just mystified by it. Certainly cultures from all around the world have always been drawn to it, to both its source of goodness and also its inherent danger, right? Which is, again, something that you can absolutely talk about God as, is that
it's magical,
he's a net
to use
good.
your words.
Yeah,
it's magical.
Fire is super magical, right? So anyway, like when you get into the stories of the saints and things like that, shining with divine light or being like fire, right? I think those are really just languages that describe the same reality. In the New Testament, you have the transfiguration of Christ as an example of what his saints are, what their destiny is, right? Is to be like him. And we see what he is, we see the transfiguration. And then when he comes back, resurrected, they don't recognize him, right? But there's insinuations that there's hints of like the transfiguration at play in some of that too, even though he's not like shining bright, like, or else they would be like, oh, he's shining bright. That's true, isn't it? Does he shine bright when he comes back in like the end of the Gospels where they talk about this stuff? I mean, I know he shows up in the room. I know that he's in the garden when the women are coming back from the empty tomb.
There are scenes that give you the hint that there's something different about the way he looks, because Mary Magdalene doesn't recognize him, and then the two disciples on the road to Emmaus don't recognize him. And so it's not using necessarily the same language that, like you said, the language that's used in the Transfiguration, his face shining like the sun or his clothes becoming dazzling white. But it's almost like there's maybe an allusion to it, to something like that.
And one occurrence that comes to mind is his revelation of St. Paul, right? When St. Paul encounters the resurrected Lord, and he's blinded.
And then
he's blinded by the light, right? And then
And his
The scales
appearance
have to get
to
removed.
John the Apostle in the book of Revelation is it's supposed to kind of
Yep.
point you back to his appearance at the Transfiguration. So yeah, that I would say
Very
is a very
true.
clear parallel, which, I mean, John would have been one of those three that went up to the Mount of Transfiguration. So
And I do.
it's sort
These
of
are
fitting.
going back to that Matrix analogy. These are the apostles having true vision. These are the apostles seeing reality as it truly is. These are the apostles seeing Christ as he truly was, and all that stuff. And it's interesting to think, even from a scientific standard, there's lots of different like frequencies of light. There's lots of different methods of seeing reality and layers to reality, whether you're talking about like the quantum layer or whatever, the cosmic layer, where depending upon like your size, like your perspective reality is kind of like relative to like the size of what you are. And yet it's all the same reality. And so again, to my mind, you're still just talking about how reality is just super weird, way weirder than we intuit when we're just like kind of like sleepwalking through life. But if you start to like study the nature of things as God has revealed it to us through our rationality, natural law stuff, and then as you start to continue to study, the revelation of Christ and the stories of the saints and the stories from the scriptures, you recognize that we've just not plumbed the depths of any of this grand mystery that is our lives, right? And at the end of the day, that's what's so magical about everything. And that's why we're all prophets, even if we don't act like prophets or think like prophets or view ourselves as prophets. In this new reality that Christ has ushered in, we all have this mantle. Some of us have a natural knack for it, right? I think that's what the spiritual gifts are that St. Paul talks about, and that the church is always kind of held that people have different charism and things like that. And the same, like I'm an artist, like I have an innate ability to like draw pretty well, but my child can draw pictures too. They might not look like my pictures. They might not be as accurate or as
we may not be
receive
able
as
to
many
tell the difference
accolades.
between those pictures, but
yeah. Hey man, some of those toddlers are making good money in the modern art circuits these days.
I know.
So
why aren't you
don't
recording your
judge.
kid and putting it on YouTube? Just have him draw it, and
That's what I need to. Yeah, absolutely. I need to take advantage of
monetize your kid.
Monetize. That's right.
Isn't that why you?
What's
isn't
the
that
word?
why you
I'm
had
trying
the
to.
last
I'm
one?
trying to find exploit. There you go. I have all these natural resources to exploit. That's what kids are for. Exploitation.
Oh, Jacob. Like you struggled to come up with the word exploit. It's cute.
I have
That's
to
very
put up
cute.
appearances.
It's just so hard for me to imagine such a concept. It's like I couldn't even think of the word of it.
Who would exploit anything? Certainly not I. But anyway, anyone can draw, right? How well they communicate with the drawing is whatever, up in the air. Some people have a knack for it. And I do think that the prophecy is something that some people have a God-given knack for in a way that others don't. But in some sense, we all have the Spirit of God as Christians, and the potential for any of the spiritual gifts. And, St. Paul says to covet the ones that are the most important, all that.
That sounded very much like a closing of the show, but we still have more to talk about. So I don't know if maybe you want to move things around after we're done.
Well, here's the question. What else are we going to talk about now that's not going to be just like a diminishment from
exactly.
the
so that's why we're going to have to
splice
the rest of this in.
There's no
Jacob's
way.
soliloquy.
This is unedited. This is exactly how people are going to receive this when it goes to.
It's too bad that we don't name the chapters, because we could have called that Jacob's soliloquy, and acting students could have studied it for years to come, and that would be their senior thesis in their acting school. So
hey,
I wanted to get to Jeremiah, if it's okay with you.
Go.
Jeremiah was another example we haven't talked about yet.
I'll give a second soliloquy at the end of that one too, and it'll be just as good as the first.
So why I wanted to bring him, he's a somewhat unique prophet because, well, he's all about the impending threat of destruction and exile, right? He's the one, he's the last one before the Babylonian, or the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and then the Israelites going into exile. And that's obviously the first huge, like, once they get to the promised land, this is like the first huge thing that now they do return. But then they're, of course, they're never themselves again. They're never the same after this Babylonian exile. And because they're always overpowered, they're never in the place that they were during the time of David and Solomon, things like that. And
Sure.
and why he's such an important example too, or at least how he connects to Gandalf, is, you have this, Gandalf always has this reputation of, it's like he's the messenger that everybody wants to shoot, because he's the one that's accused of, because he's the one telling them the hard truths, he's the one blamed for when those hard truths come to fruition, right? Whether we have Theoden, who, again, was under the influence of Wormtongue at the time, but we have that conversation where he's accusing him of being the bringer of bad tidings and not just the one trying to warn you of it. And then Denethor. It's the same thing, right? Now, Denethor doesn't have anybody to blame but himself, but, he has the Palantir, but there again,
he has the
that was his
Palantir
choice.
Which is kind of like a fortune teller's orb, right? So that's
that's a good
kind of plays
kind of
in the sandbox of what we're talking about.
It's kind of a good contrast, though, right? Because you have the real prophet, and then you have this like false prophet that you try to almost like mechanize, or like the
kind of
Palantir.
fascinating. No, when you think about it like that, you have the true prophet in Gandalf. You have the false prophet in Saruman working his schemes through Grima and Theoden. And then he
had access to the Palantir too, so that's another
fallen.
good...
I meant to say the fallen prophet kind of thing with Saruman, and then the false prophet with Denethor, who was trying to take the power. Because at least Saruman was given his mission as well as Gandalf was. He just uses it nefariously, and then Denethor tries to take the mantle onto himself, kind of thing, with using the tools of magic, the tools of the wizards and things like that.
Well, it's funny you say that, because he almost tried to, like, people would see him as trying to usurp the kingship too, as well as the prophetic, right? By taking the Palantir, like
that's
you
true.
said.
That's a really interesting point.
I guess we need a Denethor episode.
That's right. That's what we need to do. Lord of the Rings all the way down, baby. But the prophet is never welcome in his own country, right? That's what Christ said. And so you have these peoples who are meant to be welcoming of Gandalf, welcoming of the messenger of the Valar and things like that. They're the source. They are the peoples of goodness in Middle Earth, right? With Gondor and Rohan. And but they do not receive Gandalf well, at least in the context of the Lord of the Rings story. And the elves, they do. The elves typically do. But even the elves kind of like side-eye him sometimes a little bit. Like, what are you up to now, Gandalf?
And to your point, in a sense, that Middle-earth isn't Gandalf's home. It isn't any of the Istari's home. So he doesn't ever feel welcome, but it would make the most sense that he would feel the most welcome with elves, because they're the most otherworldly of the creatures of Middle-earth. So it does kind of fit. I mean, like you said, it was never perfect, but it's never going to work with anybody, right? He's never going to feel totally at home in Middle-earth at all. He's always a wanderer, even until he goes to the Grey Havens at the end. So...
Sure.
I didn't mean to I didn't mean to cut you off.
There was no cutoff. No. I'm done.
Oh, no monologue on that one.
Wait, no soliloquy. Is this where I give the second soliloquy? Are we wrapping up? What else do you want to talk about? No, this is your show, Mike. Your show. Go on. What's next on the outline?
Can we get that in writing, please? So. I hope this is being recorded, so our producer heard that. Okay. we talked Jeremiah
wink.
Giving the impending threat of destruction and exile, how he's ignored or rejected, which very much happened to Jeremiah. I was trying to think of like how do the prophets like live this out, sort of. You think of Gandalf the Grey. becomes this like fighter for the good side or for truth, and he sort of like dies, or he has this kind of death scene with the Balrog, comes back as Gandalf the White, the head of the Order, but he's sort of like, it's not that the Istari were ever supposed to be like warriors. And maybe you could chalk this up to like the whole Peter Jackson trying to make it an action movie, but Gandalf does serve a role as this warrior many times throughout the Lord of the Rings too. And so you have this like kind of like spiritual warfare, spiritual combat that you'll see in the lives of, like I said, the prophets who would have to cast out demons, or the apostles in the New Testament casting out demons, or the lives of the saints casting out demons as well. And so and of course him fighting the Balrog. I mean, you don't get much more demonic than that figure in the Lord of the Rings too. So you have that sort of, I guess, theme or motif. But
I was about to say, in the books, they make it more action-packed in the movie, but at the same time, the books do talk about him like smoting his ruin upon the mountainside or something like that.
Yeah.
Which I probably only remember because they do quote that in the movie.
Yeah,
but I'm pretty sure it's taken from the book, which is such an awesome line. Smoting his ruin. But upon the mountainside. That was sick. But yeah, they give it quite the epic battle in the movie version. The books don't really go into all that. And really all you really see in the books is him kind of like circumventing the Balrog by breaking the bridge of Khazad-dûm and causing him to fall into the pit kind of thing. But there had to have been some kind of fight, or else there wouldn't be the smiting upon the ruins of the mountain with his ruin. So there had to have been some warrior things
just another
going on.
excuse to say the line, right?
That's
Say smote
how many
upon the
times
mountainside.
can I say smote his ruin upon the mountainside in one episode?
We did not have a bet beforehand before we started recording of how many times you could fit it in. So then we've alluded to John the Apostle as well, because even though like he had this prophetic role, especially in writing the book of Revelation, because now what's interesting about that is anyone will tell the context of him receiving that vision and when he wrote Revelation was when he was in exile. So John himself was a wanderer at the time too. And that's when he has this apocalyptic prophecy. So again, you don't think of it purely in terms of doom and gloom, but and go back to what we've been talking about with prophecy. It's not just that he had a crystal ball and he was looking into the future. It's that he was seeing the spiritual reality for what it was, right? The veil had been cast aside, and he was seeing, in a sense, what was eternally happening. Whether we'd want to talk about the lamb being slaughtered from the foundation of the earth, and how that becomes the mode of worship. And you'll have a lot of, especially Catholics who read Scott Hahn, who's a biblical theologian, talk about how the book of Revelation was like the blueprint for the Mass almost. And so if John is having this vision of the worship in heaven, that's what the church used to, in a sense, put together the worship on earth. And I don't say that as if it's like in contradiction to Eastern Orthodox divine liturgy. Wherever it corresponds, it's gonna.
We're super on the same page there, 100%.
But then, the fighting of the
book
dragon.
Book of Revelation is
liturgical.
It's a liturgical text, is my understanding. My also is when it comes to the prophecy side of the apocalypse. Again, so we'll just do an whole episode on apocalypse one of these days, right? It should be a pretty interesting episode. But as it overlaps with prophecy and things like that, my understanding of the book of Revelation is that, yes, it is a depiction of the final days, the end times. But we've been in the final days, the end times, since Christ arrived, and then
St. Peter says it on Pentecost. Yeah, he says we're in the last days. So
this is the second half of the story, the last half of the story. We're in the final days, and in B, this covers something that we talked about last conversation. It is that kind of eternal cycle of what spiritual warfare looks like. And so what you're seeing in the book of Revelation is not just a prophecy of the future that isn't currently happening. It's a depiction of reality as it really is. And what apocalypse actually means is, revelation, like you're unveiling what's actually true, what's actually there, right? That's really not meant to be like in the future. Like I'm going to show you the future. It's like I'm going to show you the nature of things, the nature of reality itself. And that will be the case at the ends. The final cycle will look like that too.
So the last thing before we wrap up, because I know you've been looking forward to it, you've been trying to wrap up for the last 20 minutes now, is so you want to know the giveaway. So remember, we've been saying how the prophet is the one who's in exile, the one who's the wanderer, the one who So what is Gandalf's elvish name? Mithrandir.
You didn't even let me say it.
The gray.
Jerk.
No, I was rhetorical. It means.
I thought you were trivia. I was like, trivia.
This can be your trivia question. What does Mithrandir mean?
The wanderer.
The Grey Wanderer. That's why he's Gandalf the Grey. So Mithrandir, the Grey Wanderer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
So
very good.
Well, that kind of brings us to a final close. Jacob, let me have the last word in for once.
Now you give a soliloquy, Mike.
Yeah.
And it better be better than my wrap up from 20 minutes ago.
Because No. I'm going to let the people go back to, finishing cooking up their dinner or working out or whatever they're doing while they listen to us. So thank you, Jacob, for coming and having completing this conversation. Where we got to talk about a few more specific examples, especially from the Bible, and how they connect to one of our favorite prophets in Gandalf the Grey Wanderer. And look forward to talking with you again about any of those other topics you brought up that I'll have to prepare for and all that stuff. But we appreciate you guys coming to. Yeah. Oh gosh. Appreciate you guys coming to listen to these conversations as meandering as they sometimes can be. I want to encourage you guys
That's the fun part.
Give a 5-star rating to the subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. Jacob and I always get really excited about it, especially Jacob. He always has to take screenshots and send them to me. Look at what's nice thing somebody said about me. I'd be like,
I send it to my mother every time.
Why? Yes.
And I say, see, Mom, see, I'm not that bad.
And then you look up at the username and it says Jake's mom 55 on it. And it's like, oh, Jakey's mom.
Yeah,
don't you go by Jakey?
Like,
Isn't that how it is?
Yeah, that's how it is.
So we want to encourage you guys to like, subscribe, 5-star rating, all that, and keep coming back. Tell others about it. We just really like making it, having these conversations. And now that we do this, Jacob and I don't have to meet outside of these work related things. So that's also always a nice thing too.
It's really convenient.
So yeah. So
I get to keep Mike in his place. I don't only have to deal with him for like an hour, like once a week.
We're going to cut the last word out when you said that.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.